Good evening. On behalf of the Cal Alumni Association, CAA, and tonight's other co-host, the Goldman School of Public Policy, welcome to Los Angeles Music Center and California Live. I'm Chloe Hewlett, Executive Director of the Cal Alumni Association, and I am really overjoyed to be with you tonight and absolutely delighted to see so many Southern California Cal alumni and friends. I want you to know how important it is that you are supporting events like this that encourage open dialogue on cutting-edge issues. Tonight's theme is a matter of degree. California's spending on prisons and higher education. I know you share my anticipation about having this esteemed group of panelists here to help us navigate through this complex and significant issue. A number of you have already submitted questions for our panelists online. Some of you may also be completing question cards tonight. Our staff members will be collecting these as you finish them. The panelists will answer a number of these questions during the latter half of our discussion. I'm sure you've noticed cameras present. We are broadcasting tonight's discussion live on Cal Alumni Association's YouTube for her work.
Wow.
We are very fortunate to have Kim moderating tonight's conversation. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Kim Baldonado.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Chloe. Thank you, everyone, for coming out. We've all shared horrific traffic stories, so I appreciate everyone braving the LA traffic to get here. I want to introduce our esteemed panel, starting with Robert Birgeneau on my left here. He's the 9th Chancellor of UC Berkeley and an internationally distinguished physicist who's not one to shy away from speaking out on social issues. During his time as Chancellor, Berkeley became the first university to offer comprehensive financial aid to undocumented students. Way ahead of his time. And the first public university to provide significant financial aid to middle-class students. In addition to his academic and research work, Bob, along with teams of experts in education, policy, business, and philanthropy, has dedicated his time and energy to the Lincoln Project. That has been evaluating the government's role in funding higher education and has actually come up with recommendations for ensuring affordability, access, and the maintenance of high standards at the nation's public colleges and universities. We'll be hearing more about the Lincoln Project a bit later in the program, and I also wanted to add he was the first in his family to graduate from high school. Right? And then became Chancellor of Berkeley. Steven Raphael received his PhD in economics from UC Berkeley and is now a professor with the Goldman School of Public Policy. Steve is a research fellow at the National Bureau of Economic Research, the California Policy Lab, the University of Michigan National Poverty Center, the University of Chicago Crime Lab, IZA, which maybe he'll tell me what that stands for later, Bonn, Germany, and the Public Policy Institute of California. His research interests include labor, urban economics, and criminal justice policy. His most recent research focuses on the social cost of the nation's large incarceration rates and racial disparities in criminal justice outcomes. He's one of the co-authors of the book, Why Are So Many Americans in Prison? And Carol Liu served in the California Assembly from 2000 to 2006, in the California Senate from 2008 to 2016. As a legislator, her focus included public education, poverty, and criminal justice reform, with the belief that all three are linked. And prior to getting into politics, she earned teaching and administrative credentials from UC Berkeley and spent 17 years working in public schools. She is also a Cal Alumni board member. So as you can see, our panel is incredibly knowledgeable on tonight's topic. It's a very complex topic, so I'm eager for them to share their knowledge with us on how this trend of divesting from higher education and spending more on incarceration got started, why it continues, and what we can do about it. So a little bit of background. 40 years ago, California spent more than 3 times as much on funding a student in the public higher education system than it did on a prisoner. Today, more than $70,000 is spent per inmate per year, while about $8,000 is spent on a UC student and around $7,000 on a Cal State student. I remember years ago taking a sociology of education class at Cal and learning about the state's master plan for higher education. That was created back in 1960 with a very lofty goal of offering higher education to any state resident who wanted it. In 1974, it was providing nearly 1/3 of total revenues for higher ed, but now it's only 12%, which obviously puts a strain on the universities and on the students attending. I'd like to start by asking Bob to talk briefly about what factors started California on this trend of divesting in higher education, and then I'd like to hear from Steve on what policy changes during that same time drove the state to start investing heavily in prisons. Bob?
So one of the things that we learned, and let me give the background on the Lincoln Project, just to give it a context. So Bob Haas was one of the great supporters of Cal. Myself had dinner with Leslie Berlowitz, who was at that time president of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. It was frankly a fundraising effort on Berlowitz's part, on Leslie's part, with Bob Haas. And I was sitting there. This was like 2010, 2011. I was bemoaning, sorry, Carol, but what appeared to be our egregious mistreatment by the state. And I'll come back. I'll be nicer.
Okay.
And so we were talking about this, and then Leslie, who's the American Academy, has people from all 50 states. She said, well, you know, California's not alone. And we talked about this, and we talked about this. And so then we decided to put together a group, which became the Lincoln Project, of business people, academics, et cetera, try and understand nationally what was happening. So one of the things that we discovered was that actually there were many states where the disinvestment was larger than it has been in California. So this is not a uniquely Californian phenomenon, and that's actually quite important to understand because it's too easy to blame Jerry Brown or the state legislators, and you can blame them if you want. We've got Carol here, but
I'm retired.
You're right.
But in fact, that's actually not going to solve any problems. And one of the most recent events that we did was Lincoln Project event was in Wisconsin, where we met with politicians, et cetera. Everybody wanted to blame Scott Walker. And I was in this odd position of saying, please stop blaming Scott Walker. If you had a left-wing Democrat in power, you'd be in exactly the same situation. This has nothing to do with Scott Walker and more conservative Republican approach. It has to do with the realities of the challenges that state governments are facing. And maybe we'll talk some more and I can elaborate because I've already talked long enough. But I think one of the things that's very important to understand is that the disinvestment in higher education is the result of many complex factors. One of which, however, which is why we have Steve here, is that one thing we learned is nationally that whereas funding of public higher education across the country has stayed approximately flat, gone down per student, but in terms of number of dollars, and the funding of the prison system has gone up by 141%, right? 141% across the country, not just in California. So there's been an astounding increase in investment in incarcerating people across the entire United States. And there are about 10 states, the number varies, which actually spend more money of their total budget incarcerating people than giving them a higher education.
So Steve, why is that? And when did that trend start of investing so heavily in the prison system, and why did that begin?
Well, the number of people that end up in any state prison system is quite simply a function of basically how many people you send there and then how long they're going to be when they're there. And those two factors basically are determined by your sentencing practices. So basically, sentencing is the tail that wags the prison dog, right? And what happened in California is also what happened in other states, that we used to incarcerate people at the rate of about 100 per 100,000. And then, like many other states, we introduced a series of sentencing reforms that made it much more difficult for parole boards to release somebody earlier than their original sentence. We passed a series of laws that mandated mandatory minimums for specific crimes, whether it would be for an offense involving a firearm or a particular drug offense. We passed a lot of laws that added a whole bunch of enhancements for particular aspects of the crime. And then, like many other states, we passed laws that said people who commit a felony have to serve at least 80% of their sentence. And then, not surprisingly, and then at the same time, we sort of expanded the definition of crimes that we deemed worthy of a prison sentence. So we started sending more people to prison, and then they were there for longer, and as a result, the prison population grew from 100 per 100,000 to about 475, almost 500 per 1,000 at its peak in 2007 or 2008. And entirely that was, not really driven by changes in criminal offending. There was an increase in violence during the 1980s, but from 1990 onwards, we've had a pretty steep decline in crime to the point where we have crime rates that are historically low levels in the United States and California. But our policy still reflects a sort of tough on crime, severe sentencing, use prison liberally, and I don't mean liberally as in Jerry Brown liberally, but use it a lot liberally. Sentencing regime, which has recently changed in California, and as a result, our prison population has shrunk.
I was going to ask what was going on in the 80s and 90s that led to that. I know there was the crack epidemic here in Southern California, which saw a lot. But why did we suddenly become so tough on crime? Was it just the political climate? And maybe Carol can address this as well. And why was there so much pressure to pass these laws to increase the...
Oh, I mean, people were very, and they still are, pretty intolerant of drug use. And there was a national program to outlaw drugs and put people who were involved in either users or people who perpetrated the crime to, get the money, et cetera, to put these folks in jail. It's very interesting. When I was in the Senate, in 2008, so this is pretty late. 2016, a group of us went to Portugal to take a look at how they deal with their drug policy. And the Portuguese treat their drug users as a health problem, not a criminal problem. So they have, and then that was in a New York Times article maybe 2 weeks ago, that really relieved their system from incarcerating so many people. California, interesting enough, has passed a couple of initiatives that they too, the public, have seen that it's not cost effective to deal with drug users as a crime, and we've been slowly moving to trying to treat drug users as a health issue, but we haven't built the steps to do this.
As in the late 80s, California, some of you may remember, voted for mandatory minimum state funding for K through 12 public schools, which means that this now takes up a huge chunk of the budget, no matter what, basically. And Carol, you've said that this means there will always be a battle between public education or higher education and the prison system. It's sort of fighting for what's left. How much of a role did that play in?
It's a huge role. So you have Prop 98. That guarantees, close to, as the consequence of Prop 98 is that more than half the budget goes to K-14. That includes the 2 years in community colleges. And what's left, then you have Health and Human Services and the obligation that we need to meet in order to get the equal amount of dollars from the feds, et cetera. And then you're left with fighting transportation, infrastructure. So you're left fighting between higher ed and public safety. And for a long time, at least 15 years, that fight has culminated in not necessarily, well, we spend an incredible amount of money now. I mean, I think it's about 9% of the general fund budget on public safety, 12% on higher ed, but higher ed is divided between the three segments, doesn't go to the University of California, it goes between the CSUs, who are totally dependent upon general fund monies. It goes to the community colleges, augmenting also the 2 years that they get from Prop 98, and the UC system. So, it's spread pretty thin, and the UCs have seen, this is why we're here, the UCs have seen a decline in the number of dollars dedicated to their folks.
Steve, we talked briefly about this before, about the role of unions and the prison guard union and salaries and pensions and why that takes up. Can you talk briefly about that and what role does that play in the prison system getting so much money?
Sure. So on average, we spend about $70,000 per inmate. Roughly 40% of it or so is deemed security costs. Much of it is labor costs. Another third is medical costs for inmates. And then the rest are administrative costs. Very little actually has to do with sort of feeding and maintaining the inmates just as individuals in rehabilitative programming. And so that's our budget. We're high relative to other states. There are other, I think the average across states is around 40. There are some states that are as low as 15 or 16,000. And the main difference, frankly, is the states with very, very large populations with very overcrowded prisons and that have ununionized workers tend to be very low-cost states, and the states that have unions tend to be higher-pay states, and as a result, you spend more per inmate.
In the past 10 years, we talked about in the 80s and 90s, the increase in laws and sending more people away for more crimes and longer, but there's sort of been a reverse of that trend lately. Talk about the other referendums and the court rulings which have dealt with prison overcrowding that have actually reduced the prison population.
Sure. So the history, at the time that California's prison population was increasing to its peak of 170,000 plus inmates, the rated capacity of the state's 34 prison was about 80,000 beds. And so at one point we had a population relative to the capacity of the institutions that was almost 200%. And there was a series of actually two very, very well-known lawsuits that were filed on behalf of inmates that were alleging that the state was not providing adequate mental health care and medical care. This resulted in a three-judge federal panel ordering the state to reduce its prison population. It was appealed to the Supreme Court, and in 2011, the Supreme Court basically affirmed the ruling of the lower court that the state had to do something. And so the state passed in 2011 Assembly Bill 109, that's commonly referred to as corrections realignment. And basically what it did is it transferred a lot of responsibilities down to the counties for relatively less serious offenses, for punishing people, and they're punished with alternative sanctions and spells in county jail rather than state prison. And for people that are leaving prison, rather than being a ward of state parole with the possibility of being revoked back to prison for a technical violation, if they didn't have a serious or violent offense on their criminal history, they became basically the sort of responsibility of local and county probation, who, when they violated, would be punished with a local sanction rather than a state prison sanction. So relatively quickly, we saw our prison population drop by about 30,000 people, but then we saw an offsetting increase in our jails of about 10,000. And then the other big reform, there's a few others, and we can talk about if we have the time, but in 2014, the voters passed Proposition 47, which took a bunch of crimes that are commonly referred to as wobbler crimes. So they're crimes that can either be charged as a felony or a misdemeanor, and most of them were drug offenses, and then also some property crimes, and defined them down as misdemeanors. And what that led to was an immediate decline into bookings in the county jail, immediate decline into admissions in state prison. People who had a first strike or second strike that were, sort of caught for something that was now a misdemeanor weren't getting that third strike and being sent to state prison, and that sort of brought our prison population out further.
Which begs the question then, if our prison population has gone down over the past 10 years, why has the cost of incarcerating the inmates not gone down as well?
Well, I think that it depends on, it's the cost relative to what? So the three-judge federal panel said we had to reduce the ratio of inmates to rated capacity to 137.5%. So one way is we could have done that.
I'm dying to know how they came up with that number.
Yeah,
That's for another topic.
But that's the number they came up with. So one way you can do that, if you're at near 200, is you can build a lot more prisons, right? And if you build a lot more prisons, it means you'd have to hire a lot more staff, and you'd have all the capital expenditures and everything that goes with maintaining. And so relative to that scenario, we saved a lot of money. But relative to our initial spending level, we're actually spending more. And part of that reason is, well, there have been increases in the actual allocations to CDCR, but there's also been a fair amount of money that's been transferred to the counties to manage their new caseload. And so we're actually spending more on corrections criminal justice now than before. I think part of it is just that there's a distinction between the marginal cost of an inmate and the average cost of an inmate. So if you reduce the population by 30,000, it doesn't mean you can guard 30% of the less of the perimeter, right? Or staff 30% less time. There's a large fixed cost associated with maintaining a prison system. And we're so overcrowded, and we're still overcrowded, but now we have staffing levels that are matched to the number of people we have, and that's kind of what we had before.
Carol, do you want to jump in as the former state legislator? Why did the state budget for prison system not go down?
Well, because I think what we have left in our prison system are those that are most difficult and the most needy in terms of medical care. We're still under federal receivership in terms of our medical care, and that's been very expensive. When I was there, we were trying to get our act together so that we would get rid of the person in charge of this, but the state still has him around, and he's very expensive.
In the current state budget, Health and Human Services, like Carol mentioned, gets the most funding, just over $60 billion. K through 12 is next with $54 billion. Higher education, which includes UC, CSUs, and community colleges, has actually seen a bit of an increase in its budget at $15 billion, while prisons are at $13.7 billion. To all three panelists, what can Californians do if we want to, and I'm sure everyone in this room and watching wants to have more of a say in how our tax dollars are spent?
Isn't that what elections are for?
Yeah, right.
Right?
Is it that simple, though?
And holding, well, so first of all, I'll go back to what I said earlier, but Steve and Carol have both said, which is that, with all of the propositions and then requiring that certain percentages of money get spent on certain things and the increasing bureaucracy, it is the reality that the state legislature has progressively less flexibility.
Right. So basically their hands are tied because the voters keep
Partly.
coming up with
Partly.
propositions.
Partly.
That doesn't explain the whole thing, but it's a really important part of it. And on our panel, or on the Lincoln Project, one of the more outspoken members was Phil Bredesen, who was governor of Tennessee from 2003 to 2011 for 8 years. And he's totally committed to education. But then he discussed all of the challenges of running a state like Tennessee and with all of the imperatives that come from the federal government. And it is a reality that the state government budgets are progressively more constrained. And as I said, our conclusion was that it's not going to reverse itself. So it would be great if we reduce prison costs by let's say I think you said 12, how many billion?
Prisons, 13.7.
13.7. The last number I had is 11, so it's already gone up from there. But let's suppose we cut that in half. That doesn't mean that $6 billion is now going to be transferred to higher education. Right?
Right.
I mean, Jerry Brown's going to build his train, or, you just, right? So, right? Or we're going to repair the roads, or who knows what, right?
So how does higher education get more money?
Yeah. So first of all, the United States is the only country among those that we compete with that doesn't recognize that having strong public higher education is a national asset, not just a state asset. Right? We're alone in that. So every other federal government invests significantly in public higher education. I just spent, I and the former president of Yale together went over to Japan to give their government advice in terms of how their government is financing higher education. It was a really interesting exercise. it was particularly interesting to see a federal government that cares deeply about public education. It was like a revelation, right? The Canadian government, even under Harper, invested really quite significantly. So first of all, we need the federal government to begin to play a role in supporting public higher education. They will need to do that in partnership with states, because states are not going to give up control over, and they shouldn't. We don't want to hand control over to the federal government. It's my own view that especially in California, that our major corporations are what I call free riders. I mean, they're not contributing, basically, to public higher education. They pay very low taxes because most of their money is offshore. Secondly, they just, and they're not philanthropic. So
They don't have to. They're not going to do it.
they won't. They don't. And so, 50 years ago, when major corporations felt that they had significant social responsibilities, right, to support the enterprise that fed them, then universities were in a better situation. I talked to the president of arguably California's most successful high-tech corporation, and was basically the Berkeley graduate. I was basically complaining to him, and he literally said to me that if he did what I was requesting, which was a significant investment in Berkeley, right, by his corporation, not by him personally, right, just to recognize all the graduates we sent to his company, just like, right. He said I'd be out at the next stockholders meeting. He literally said that.
But yet
what his stockholders
corporations
care about.
Go ahead.
What they care about is
The bottom line.
the bottom line, right? And that they don't see it. They think they pay too many taxes, even though they don't. Now you're hearing a political opinion, right? And because they have huge amounts of money offshore. This corporation has billions offshore, so they don't have to pay taxes on them.
But corporations are consistently complaining that they can't find skilled, educated
Yes,
workers.
right. So that's what I said. So I said, you hire a lot of our graduates, you want more. So why don't you, for example, provide scholarships to undergraduates who are getting educations in the area where you're complaining that there's a shortage of workers? And then that's when I got this response of, well, our stockholders wouldn't see how that helps our bottom line. So anyway, one way or another, whether it's through tax incentives or what have you, probably has to be through tax incentives. Repatriation of this now I think it's up to $2.7 trillion that's offshore right now. That's one thing that's bipartisan. Both Republicans and Democrats agree. We have to bring some of that money back. If 1% of that was devoted to higher education, that would basically not quite solve our problems, but it would be a tremendous impact on public higher education. So 1% of the money that's held offshore, if that were repatriated and went to higher education, that would go a very long way. And for some universities like Berkeley, thanks to the kind of people who are sitting in the audience, we've seen really a significant growth in philanthropy, in private philanthropy. We're extremely grateful for that. During my time as chancellor, our money from philanthropy far exceeded the money we got from the state, literally. So that, without the generosity of our alumni, actually, we would have been in much worse financial situation than we were. And that is continuing, and so we need, right? But this has to be done in ways, and we can't just have the philanthropists over here, business not contributing over here, the federal government not taking the kind of responsibility federal governments in every other country does. So we need to somehow or other put together a new model for the support of public higher education.
Because then that also makes it an uneven process. So,
exactly.
The UCs end up becoming in the fundraising game, and some that have more affluent alumni get more, and
So
whereas it should be a state responsibility.
Sorry, I don't want to take all this, but
I like this back and forth.
Just to follow. In fact, actually, one of our donors gave a scholarship fund of $25 million to the community colleges, a set of community colleges, but they had to match it. And so I actually met with several leaders of the community colleges, explained how we do fundraising at Berkeley. They just said, we can't raise it, we can't do it, and they actually gave up the money. So $25 million of scholarship money for low-income community college students got passed on because the community colleges said, we can't afford to hire the fundraisers because you can't just go out and say, hey, give me some money. Right? I mean,
I think that climate has changed a little bit.
I hope so.
The state in the most recent years, the last couple of budgets, when you talk about the increase in the amount of dollars going to higher ed, it's been going to the community colleges. Mm-hmm. Because in the state of California, we need to have about 2.5 million more college-educated BAs coming out of our system in order to maintain the kind of economy that we're used to. That's just to keep it even, and we're far behind in reaching that number. So the thinking is that if you get kids at the community college, when I was chair of the higher ed committee, it was taking kids 7 years to get through the system for a 2-year degree or a 2-year transfer or 2-year certificate. 7 years floating through the system, and it just was not acceptable. CSUs they were taking 6 years for a 4-year degree. That makes it more expensive for all of us as taxpayers to get these kids out of the system. And so the emphasis has been capturing those kids at the 2-year level, getting them more help and focus so that they can move on with their lives. The University of California system has been relatively, compared to the other two systems, more, well, at least better at graduation rates. They could improve some, but kids are getting out in 4 years, and transfer kids come in and only take 2 years, et cetera. So the system seems to be working well enough. And quite frankly, because the UCs get federal dollars and other kinds of grant monies, et cetera, they're not seen in the legislature as really being as needy as the community college system and the CSUs. And as far as I'm concerned, the CSUs are the weakest link because they totally depend upon the state for their resources. And at the community college, there are about 2 million students in the community colleges, and half of them are on BOG waivers. And that's the Board of Governor waivers, which means that those kids are not paying any kind of fees at all to go to school. Now, I'm involved in Pasadena City College, and they're doing a campaign to fund books, materials, living cost for kids for 2 years if you take a full load. And that's where the movement is happening among some community colleges, because we have a lot more of underserved kids coming into the system without the wherewithal, or they don't have a path to follow because they don't have parents or other siblings. That they're kind of pioneers in their own way, and so they need more assistance, and so we're trying to help those folks. But also, talking to the Chloe over there, we're having the same issues at the UCs, first generation kids who don't know how to get through the system and navigate through the system. And we're seeing different kind of kids coming through the system because the system has opened itself up to all qualified kids. And it's a challenge. It's a challenge financially.
But should that responsibility be on the individual colleges and universities to fundraise and find ways to get the students through the system?
Well, I think the state plays a role in this. I mean, because we want to have kids with more advanced degrees or certificates so they can be well employed. That just brings more resources to the state. So it needs to happen at all levels, and you need to have a support system that really understands and connects all the dots. I was reading, Chloe, at the last TAP lunch you had, or dinner you had, this little blurb about a young man that was getting a scholarship who comes out of he had a felony. A young man who decided to get himself straight and go back to college. Well, that kind of student today is much different than the kind of student that I was, too many years ago. And so that kind of student really needs the assistance of not only financing his education, but needs support systems of how to navigate through the system.
Bob, you said we need to change the model completely. What would that model look like, and how do we get there?
I think it's a model in how we get there is a challenge. I thought we had a strategy, but
You've got all the best minds working on
yeah,
it. We're counting on you.
Yeah, right. So, I mean, we have a lot of different ideas. There's no, first of all, there's no silver bullet, right? So I think that's really important to understand. You know, the silver bullet of going back to the state and just say, you know, give us lots more money.
Right.
It's not going to happen.
That is not going to happen, right? Philanthropists, you know, they're very important for Berkeley, and if we could get everyone who gives money to Stanford to send it across the bay, right? That might be enough, actually, but in any case, so you know, we're actually evolving towards a model in which we have multiple sources, where like everybody, you know, there's the overhead on research grants, which partly goes to support the research, but it's, let's say it's 5% of our budget, right? Okay. Mostly from the federal government. And then you have 15-20% from student tuition, and then you have 12% from the state, and et cetera, right? But missing is direct support of the operating budget from the federal government, as I said already, and minimal contributions from major corporations. So we need to piece together all of these, but they need to be done in a partnership kind of way, not just sort of scattershotted, so that we actually have some kind of a systematic overall budget where the different components I've mentioned, and maybe others that you can think of, agree that they will carry a particular percentage of the cost of higher education. I do want to say one thing, which is that, because I don't want to be all negative, especially here in California. So one of the other things we've done a study of more recently, and we're in the process of publishing it, is studying financial aid, need-based financial aid across the United States. That is, how much money is made available, whether it's from the state or from other sources, to enable low-income students to attend university and graduate without significant debt. Because of my own personal background, I have a particularly deep interest in that aspect of higher education. So of the 50 states, California is number one. We are the single best state in the union for providing access to students from low-income backgrounds. So we can actually be extremely proud of that.
Without having them graduate with a lot of debt? Or
no,
just,
we have the lowest debt in the country.
Oh, the lowest. Okay, that's what you were.
We have the lowest debt in the country.
Right.
So unfortunately, so this is counterintuitive, but it happens to be true. I wrote an op-ed that the LA Times loved. They published it instantly. The title of which was, "Why is Bernie Sanders trying to increase income inequality?" Okay.
It's not going over well in this room.
Right.
We're sure there's more to it than that title.
Which is a fact. It's a fact. Okay. So the reason is, is that a major source of financial aid for low-income students is the set-aside, which is that the 1/3 of the tuition that either the state pays through Cal Grants or people who can afford to pay are quite low tuition, right? Pay 1/3 of that goes into financial aid for low-income students to pay for their food and their room and board, okay? That's how they eat. Our low-income students are able to eat food because well-to-do students pay tuition, okay? If you let our well-to-do students go to college for free, then a major source of financial aid for low-income students that makes college, that enables them to live dignified lives disappears. So then they're not going to go to college because you can't go to college if you can't eat. And you can't eat if you don't have financial aid, which comes from the tuition paid by students from privileged backgrounds. Okay? And so that's the reason why, oddly, with respect to community colleges, if you're a low-income student and you live away from home, it's cheaper to go to Berkeley than to go to a community college. That's an empirical fact in California. Because our financial aid system works so well for TAP students. And by the way, I have to say...
Explain what TAP students are.
Yeah. So this is a program. We should have Chloe explain it. This is this wonderful program.
It is a wonderful program. Right.
Which the Alumni Association runs for ultra-low-income students, students whose family income is under $20,000. Okay, so we do a great job on need-based financial aid. It may or may not shock you that the worst states for financial aid basically provide no money to low-income students are predominantly in the Deep South. So states like Louisiana, they provide no money, zero, to low-income students. So it's totally astounding, actually, right? Like state money, like how can this be? But it is,
Right.
okay? They have merit scholarships, which tend to go to students from privileged backgrounds, right? Right? Because they get higher SAT scores because they went to the best schools in the suburbs, but they have no need-based. So in California, our financial aid system in UC and Cal States is entirely need-based, right? And the state gives generously. And when we went through this period where our tuition doubled, which made a lot of students very unhappy, right? That the state doubled the size of the Cal Grant, right? Which they didn't have to. State of Michigan did the exact opposite, by the way. State of Michigan decimated their support for low-income students. At the time that they cut budgets, the first thing they cut was support for low-income students. We did not do that in California. Jerry Brown did not do that. Schwarzenegger did not do that. And I think we actually owe them. It's so easy to take shots at them. One thing I did want to say is the one unfortunate thing we've seen here in California is that tuition was held frozen for 6 years. And everybody says, isn't that great? It makes university more accessible. So our low-income students' debt has gone up by $3,000 because tuition was held fixed for the reason I had just explained. So we have put our students deeper in debt by not increasing tuition. That's an empirical fact at Berkeley.
I think what gets lost a lot of times is people don't realize when tuition is increased, that, as you mentioned, the financial aid is increased for the lowest
because low-income
students.
students don't pay tuition,
Right.
So the tuition is zero if your family income is under $80,000. So you don't pay it anyway. Then what you have to worry about is your room and board, and that depends on how much money is available for financial aid, and that financial aid comes from the Cal Grant and from tuition paid by well-to-do students. So we've increased debt significantly for our low-income students by keeping the costs down for students from privileged backgrounds.
Before we get to some of the questions from the audience, I want to give Steve and Carol an opportunity. Any other solutions or any way out of this? Bob's already said we can't reverse the trend. But do either of you have any thoughts on that?
I mean, I could be wrong. I wasn't God speaking down.
But in the research you're doing, other than changing the model of how it's funded.
Well, I do think that I do think it can be solvable, first of all, and I do think that, as well-being as we all are, that we do need to work collectively and get out of our silos to try to solve this problem, if indeed it's high on your priority list. And it is high in the priority list for California in order to maintain the kind of economy we have. So there are no quick fixes. There is and it's going to be some pain. And with tax reform speaking in the federal government, and California needs to get its act together in terms of tax reform also. We've never recovered, or we've never changed our tax reform since Prop 13. And we just, it doesn't need to, we just need to have a conversation about how we can better utilize the taxes that we collect and how those taxes may need to be changed from how we are currently doing the system. But that needs to be long-term, and it's really difficult to have that conversation when there's so many voices out there and maybe not enough consensus. But we need to come together to solve this problem.
Steve?
Well, I don't know if I could solve the higher education funding, or if I can solve any problem for that matter. But I do have ideas about things we can do better in terms of sentencing that might further reduce the prison population. And we should, again, give credit to the fact that California was, we were right there at the national average with our incarceration rate. We just look like, the average for the U.S., and now we're way below the average, right? So our incarceration rate now is what it was in 1990. Kind of amazing, actually. So we're before 3 strikes. We've sort of wiped out 15, 20 years of growth in a very short period of time. And part of it was that we were forced to, and part of it was that the voters of California decided that they wanted to, right? There were several initiatives that passed with very broad-based support across almost every single county in the state that moderated sentencing for second strikes and third strikes and for lesser offenses and so on and so forth. Now, there are other arguments that one could make to reform sentencing other than that you'd save money in prisons, right? There's, utilitarian concerns regarding, are we getting a lot of money in terms of, are we getting a lot of benefit in terms of crime reduction for the money we're spending? And it appears that on the margin where we weren't, at least at the levels we were before, and we could probably reduce further if we did it in a smart way. And if we reduce a little bit further, we might even be able to close an institution or two, and then we can save some real money. So I think one of the things that reformers constantly push for is kind of a categorization and systematic evaluation of mandatory minimum sentences that make it very difficult to individualize and provide little incentive for people that are incarcerated to rehabilitate when they are incarcerated. So we could revisit that. Frankly, in the grander scheme of things, I think that the research by social scientists seems to suggest that very, very early childhood investments, from nurse visits to preschool to target interventions that increase vocabulary by the age of 5, seem to have long-lasting effects on everything from earnings as an adult to the likelihood you're going to die of a heart attack at 40 to whether or not you commit crime as and so you can imagine a world where we make an investment now, but we're reaping the return to investment we made 18 years ago, and that we have that going on a continuous loop where we just have a less violent society because we invested in kids that needed it when they were young. And I mean, that would probably cost more money now, and maybe it would take out of UC's budget, but at the same time, I think in the long run, that sort of human capital investment is the direction that I think we should move in.
And just to add on to what Steve said, there are other models. Other people do it different. Other countries do it differently than we do. And there's very little rehabilitation going on in our system where, for instance, I visited a prison in Norway where it's all about rehabilitation and it's not about recidivism. It's, getting these folks back on their feet, back to being productive folks in the communities. So there is possibility out there. And there is, it's not a political thing either, because on the spectrum of folks who want to see less money spent on our prison system, there is some agreement that we should work toward finding ways to make our system more efficient, more humane, and to be more positive about the folks that have made mistakes.
One of the questions that we got tonight was about incarceration. Formerly incarcerated individuals have often struggled with reintegrating into society. How can society help them and their families succeed, and how can we increase awareness of this issue?
Well, that is a very, very difficult issue. There are sort of laundry list of reentry efforts that range from providing people with transitional jobs to providing people with more extensive reentry planning, to some innovative programs that actually have reentry pods in the jail where people will come to sort of the jail in the community where they're going to be discharged, and they can get their ID set up, they can get an address, they can establish whatever they need to establish before they reenter, rather than just leaving prison with a couple $100 in gate money and being sent back to your community. And so there's this web of sort of NGOs, service providers that contract with counties and that with the state that provide those reentry services. Many people do respond, so we do know that people that leave prison, there's a good third that are characterized by criminologists as immediate desisters, meaning they're never going back, right? And a lot of times, this is kind of a triage problem where you want to identify people that really need supervision, and then you want to also identify people that may stumble a couple times, but they're kind of more towards that immediate desister category. So part of it is just separating and targeting things appropriately. But you can run the laundry list of problems, from housing to mental health issues to sort of physical health issues. The prison population tends to be sicker on average than the average person when you hold constant age. So then the needs are great, right? And each locality in California deals with it differently to some degree, depending on the county's sort of policy structure and orientation.
Carol, you touched on this earlier. You mentioned Prop 13. One of the questions is, as tuition continues to rise and state budgets decline, what is being done to address Prop 13 reform, and why is it considered the third rail of California politics? Is there anything we should do to apply pressure for a solution?
Politically, no. I mean, there's no stomach to make changes to Prop 13 in the legislature.
And why is that?
Political, if you want to stay in office,
I love the blunt
you don't
honesty.
risk putting this on the table. So, I mean, and there's not a no one has brought forward another kind of alternative that we could work on.
You have an alternative?
I don't, but some of our students do. So I actually acted as a front person for some of our students. So they asked me, basically, their article got published in the LA Times under my name because the LA Times wouldn't publish it under their name. So it's literally true. So I published an op-ed, which was really the students' op-ed on Prop 13, and they had done a lot of research. And so their model, so I'm not taking credit, obviously, it's to our students who were very idealistic. So, Prop 13, I didn't live in California at the time. I lived in a state which actually, Massachusetts, which actually assesses property values rationally. And so, so I sort of was used to the fact that if your house goes up in value, so
would
your
your property taxes.
Right? So, and with this explosion in housing costs in California, as I understand it, Prop 13 was introduced and got so much support because it was like protecting the widow, right? And so it turns out one of the consequences of that, since we're in LA, LA homeowners may be interested to know that Disney Corporation pays property tax at the rate of 20% of what you pay. That's correct. 20%. Okay. And that's because they've owned their property for so long and they don't sell it. And whereas houses turn over and therefore the effective property tax rate on houses just keeps going up, but not for Disney Corporation, which is now, right? So if you just did a really simple thing in California, which is you said, let's leave the personal dwelling part of Prop 13 exactly where it is, and let's just do a annual reassessment of properties that's owned by corporations. Okay. Then it turns out, which is what every other state has that, right? Well, they don't have the split, but anyway.
That's the way they have always done it.
That's the way they've always done it. So if you did that in California, it turns out that will generate $9 billion a year. And if that $9 billion went to education, not just higher ed,
Problem solved.
then the problem is solved. So, right? So I once published, before it was fashionable, I published an op-ed in the LA Times about undocumented students and challenges that they face. This is long before it was a fashionable issue. I have never gotten hate mail as bad as that. Right? The level of hate. This was like more than a decade ago. It was astounding to me. It was actually personally quite upsetting. But instead of making me afraid, it just got me so angry to think that this is what our undocumented people face every day. I only faced it once because I wrote an op-ed. So I got almost as bad.
With the Prop 13
with Prop 13. Like, here's this.
Even though it would leave the personal
houses alone. It didn't matter. Here's this far left Berkeley academic, right? Trying to increase taxes and these communists at Berkeley. So it turned out that, and even the LA Times, the editor called me up to tease me, basically, like, we've never seen me.
Much feedback.
Right? So it's just exactly what Carol said. There is no
way
stomach. There's no way.
No stomach for this, right?
To me, naively, I thought, and especially, I thought the students had done all this research. I thought this is really terrific. And, that maybe 50% of people say, yeah, it's not right that Disney Corporation pays tax at a rate of 20% of the average homeowner in the LA area.
So forget Prop 13, basically. Something interesting going on. I don't know. Another question from David, class of 2007. The majority of professors have not seen substantial pay raises in recent years, and tenure-track professorship is decreasing in favor of instructors and adjuncts. With this in mind, why has the university added many high-paid administrator positions and increased existing administrator pay? I know you're no longer a chancellor, but you're probably the only one.
It won't shock you that I can answer that question. Okay. So first of all, I can only say during the time I was chancellor, we kept careful track of that, well documented, and actually the number of senior administrators went down. So this is like the myth, because everybody says that's such an easy target. The overall number of administrators went up, but that's because our research funding went up. And so people administrating research, right, and paid out of research budgets, not out of educational budgets or tuition, that number of administrators went up. So if you look at the sum total, the number went up, but the number who are actually paid out of a combination of state funding. Secondly, we actually also looked at salaries, and it turned out the rate of increase of salaries of senior administrators was identical to the rate of increase of senior professors.
And what about the tenured track professorship? Has there been a trend in decreasing those?
Yes, there has been, and that's because tuition was frozen. So freezing tuition took out of our budget, the 6-year freeze of tuition took $100 million out of our budget, which was supposed to be paying the salary of faculty. So if you take $100 million out of our budget, then you have less money to pay the salaries of faculty. So the size of departments have been decreasing. It's not complicated, right, actually. I mean, we are in the peculiar situation, and people haven't adjusted to it, and you can really tell I'm a chancellor here, not someone with 4 kids in college anymore, although I have 12 grandkids, and I promised, that's literally true, that I promised, I committed to supporting substantially while they go to college, so the first one just started, so.
Oh, no.
Anyway.
Better start saving.
So I'm going to take a collection afterwards. Anyway, so we are in the situation which is not well understood, which is that because of the dramatic drop that happened after 2008 in the level of state support, and the concomitant doubling of tuition, that 2/3 of salaries are paid by students and 1/3 by the state. It was a shocking reversal, actually, that happened very quickly. It's actually a really good argument that students should have more say in the governance of the university because they're paying the salaries. Right?
Yeah.
Right? And I actually advocated that, and the graduate students rejected that for reasons I could never understand. But anyway, so we produced a governance model in which students would actually have some say in the budget, and the graduate student union rejected it. So never know. Who knows, right? How this can ever happen, but it did. Anyway, but the reality is, just getting back to the basic point, that faculty salaries, 2/3 of the money comes from student tuition and 1/3 from the state. So the model's completely, the financial model is fundamentally different from when many of you, if you graduated before 2008, everything is now different, completely and entirely different. And people, general population, have not understood that. And the faculty overwhelmingly actually don't understand that. So every time I tell a group of faculty, well, you know, it's the students who are paying you, not
the state.
Not the state, and that should affect, like, stop complaining about the fact that you have to teach undergraduates, right?
Right.
They're paying your
salary.
Right? So anyway, so it's really quite interesting. This is really quite new, and I would say we have not adjusted to it yet. And most people don't even understand that.
Right. I think we've touched on this last question here, but I don't know if there's anything positive we can end on. What policy changes should we focus on to redirect government support to our educational institutions?
Well, I'm more goal-oriented. So if we need 2.5 more million folks with bachelor degrees or certificates for high employment, we should take a close look at increasing graduation rates, not only from our community colleges, but we have about 4 million people that have partial class credits, certificates that are out there. Maybe incentivize some of those to go back to school and finish up their degrees. That would be an easy one, except that we would have to pony up with some dollars in order to make that an incentive. And then we should also, because we are, we have a lot of veterans here in the state of California, to really incentivize them, because they do have a federal fellowship or a
So there is
scholarship,
money
right?
for them.
Right, they can pull down, and that they should be encouraged to go back and get their higher education, so that we can close that gap by 2025.
Offer some, well, again, I don't know how to fix the financing issue. Obviously, it's hard to generate new revenue sources, but there are things. I've been a UC faculty member now since 1999, first at UCSD and UC Berkeley. And now over the last 20 or so years, the degree to which you see the university as a whole just opening up to the citizens of California is kind of palpable. And there are veterans, there are students who are veterans. We have students at UC Berkeley, or underground scholars who are formerly incarcerated, who have been impacted, who are some of our best students and are, sort of just running with opportunities, and they're inspiring. And I think that changes in that direction if we just we bring the university community, we prepare people to be there, and we educate people who want to run with the opportunity. That's the direction I think that we should be moving.
Bob, you mentioned clearly this is a national issue, and with
It's
your
a
work with
national
the Lincoln Project, are there things that other states are doing now that we could do?
Well, as I said, we're the single best in financial aid,
But we're still in this situation.
Yeah, but so is every other state. So actually, we didn't see any model out there where there's some other state, unless it's Texas with their huge endowment, but then the state government's very oppressive on the university system. So we're sort of in the middle overall in California, which, again, as I said in the beginning, was educational for me, because I thought, it's like things are so bad here. They're no worse than the national average, and they're much better in terms of access for students from low-income backgrounds. So there is no magic bullet, as I said. I want to mention one more program, because this is entirely funded by our graduates. So my wife is a social worker, and in her past life, she worked with foster children. And so she and one of our faculty members got interested in how former foster kids were doing at Berkeley. Turns out we have a pretty large number of former foster kids, and it turned out they were failing out at a disturbing rate. So we put together a program to provide support to products of the foster care system. Their graduation rate is now 97%. Right? And this is entirely funded by alumni. The entire program, right, was my wife ordered me to go out and raise money. It was like not optional, right? And we did, and a number of wonderful people stepped up. Stepped up significantly. The gifts were six-figure gifts. A large number of people gave six-figure gifts. So we actually endowed a staff position. So we have endowed faculty positions. We actually have endowed a position for a staff person to provide full-time support to products of the foster care system. This person is wonderful, and she's in a way personally responsible. So we can solve individual problems. We're going to solve the underground scholars in due course. We solved it for former foster kids, right? But the sort of macroscopic problem, there is no silver. None of us so far have been smart enough to identify a silver bullet where you say, let's just do this and then everything's okay.
Right. But I'm encouraged that we can find one small problem and get people together to fix it.
And we can.
Right?
Yeah. Right. And frankly, with a lot of work led by an LA Assembly person, Gil Cedillo, but I helped, some others did, we got the state to provide financial aid to undocumented students. We're the first in the country, right? So that was the state legislature that did that, right? And it sort of went by largely, I don't think people realized the significance of it, right? Of course, it now means we have the DACA challenge of the country, right? Because we've been so successful in treating undocumented students decently, and so they're graduating, and therefore they're part of the DACA program, and now we have a huge issue for these people, whom we owe because we've given them college education.
That's a topic for another. another event. Well, thank you, all three of you, for offering your insight and your wisdom, and hopefully we've heard something that can spur all of us to take action in some small way if we work together.
I do have, before we quit tonight, I have a higher education funding in California put out by the PPIC this last March. If you'd like to see it, there are extra copies up here.
Thank you, Carol.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
You were great. Good job.
As we conclude tonight, please join me in thanking our award-winning journalists.
Thank you.
In addition, our Chancellor Emeritus, Robert Birgeneau, State Senator and always my leader, Carol Liu, and our esteemed Professor Steven Raphael for this lovely and lively discussion and for sharing their collective expertise.
I think Bob should become a full-time fundraiser, actually.
Yeah.
That's what
I'm a physics professor.
That's what I learned tonight. Full-time fundraiser.
I want to thank the Goldman School of Public Policy for their collaboration and support in co-hosting tonight's program. In particular, I want to thank members of the Goldman School Board of Advisors, the most dynamic and powerful woman I know in California, their chair, Kathy Unger. We also want to thank C.EAS staff, and there are many that deserve recognition. This team is led by the Associate Director of Alumni Engagement, David Smith. The team includes Editor-in-Chief of California Magazine, and stay tuned for the next issue, Wendy Miller, Senior Development Director, Jennifer Moore, Director of Marketing and Communications, Sarah Juckness, Advocacy Coordinator, Mitchell Handler, Sarah Yee, Associate Director, as well as Rachel Clary, Johanna Romero, Johanna Juarez, and volunteer and alumnus George Fogelson. Would you all stand and be recognized, and thank you for your tireless effort. And we also want to thank the local CAA chapter leaders who are really taking our alumni to the next level. Some you've already met. Gerard Nickdall, President, and Kim, Board Member from the Los Angeles chapter. Lashimi Reddy and Jenna Keller, Co-Presidents of the Orange County chapter. Linda Mays, President, and Danny Masarina, Board Member from the Long Beach chapter, and Susan Tang, Vice President of the San Gabriel Valley chapter. And to all the Southern California alumni chapter leaders, including those not here with us tonight but watching online, we also want to thank you. And we had a lot of mention about the Underground Scholars UCLA chapter, and we want to thank them for being with us tonight. Now, to all of our online visitors joining us back home in Berkeley and around the world, thank you for joining us. You are a significant part of this discussion, and together we will continue supporting and investing in higher education. At the Cal Alumni Association, we are doing our best each year to fight for our students and protect their rights to obtain higher education. We award, as you've heard from our esteemed Chancellor Emeritus, more than 700 students with alumni scholarships. Many of these students are our Pell recipients with family incomes under $20,000 a year. In addition, many of them are underrepresented minority scholars, and as well as first generation. I have been fortunate to know many of these students, and they are the most intelligent and passionate people I have ever met, and they will be our next generation of leaders. You can contribute to our fight for higher education by signing up to be part of our CAA advocacy team right here, right now, and tonight. We can start. By registering as an advocate, you will show your support for public higher education, and we will take it to the state and federal level. Every penny that you give keeps Cal golden. Every effort that you make keeps Cal golden. Our advocacy coordinator is here tonight, Mitchell Handler. If you'd like to learn more, please go to our website, alumni.berkeley.edu, for how to become an advocate, how to support our low-income students. And for those of you who are inspired by our conversation tonight and want to look for ways to become more active in important dialogue, on Monday, October 9th in Newport Beach, our colleagues at the University Development and Alumni Relations at Berkeley will host a Discover Cal lecture, Free Speech Now, the Berkeley Experience, and you can learn more at discovercal.berkeley.edu. For CAA, with the success of our California Live series and with subsequent events planned this year and next, we are thrilled that we continue to expand alumni engagement. This coming April 2018, the Cal Alumni Association is honored to co-host California's gubernatorial debate in San Francisco in collaboration with the Goldman School of Public Policy, the Institute for Governmental Studies, the Bay Area Council, the Daily Cal, and KPIX. So please keep those question cards available because you're going to really get the chance come April. It is our goal to continue to offer intellectually stimulating and cutting-edge events like this one. And naturally, we look forward to seeing all of you soon, in person, and for all of you online. To each and every one of you, thank you for joining us tonight. In California Live, the Golden Bear is roaring proudly in Berkeley and in Los Angeles. Let's just go Bears.
Go Bears!
And please continue the discussion.
Thank you so much.
Oh,
This was
thank you.
fascinating. I
Yeah,
learned a
thank you.
lot, which is always a good thing.